The following is an old story, but one with dramatically different results. But, regardless of how it turned out, this episode began in Bluff Springs, Florida, in the northern part of Escambia County. There, on a backwoods farm, was the family of Confederate veteran John Gordon Moore and his wife Mary Florene Ghent. Their daughter was Florence, who was born in 1884, and would marry at the age of 14 to Clarence Augustus McGowan. He was 21 years old and was from Brewton, Alabama, when the two traveled up to Greenville, Alabama on March 7, 1897 for their wedding. By 1901, their marriage was over and he had remarried in 1903, but not before their daughter, Vivian F. Moore, was born in 1899. At some point in time before 1912, Florence received training as a nurse and went to work in Mobile, Alabama, at the Mobile Infirmary. Vivian had lived with her mother except for a short time in a convent in Mobile and another in Selma. In June 1914, Florence had come down sick and was in the Mobile Infirmary for a time. Because of this, she sent Vivian home to her parents' house in Bluff Springs. Later on, Florence was sent to Scranton, Mississippi to assist in nursing a banker's wife who was ill. At the time, Florence agreed for Vivian to return to Pensacola to spend a couple of weeks with Lily Margarent Boley, one of her friends from the Sacred Heart Convent in Selma. They had planned for her to go to Olive, known today as Ferry Pass, on Sunday, July 27 to see relatives before returning to Bluff Springs. However, those plans never came to fruition. Suddenly, Florence received a special delivery letter from Mrs. Lulu Boley, wife of Louis Randolph Boley Jr., asking her to come home to Pensacola. She boarded an eastbound train and headed to Pensacola. What she didn't know at the time was that on Saturday, July 26, Vivian and Lily had decided to drive out to Fort Barrancas for a day's outing. With her mother in Mobile and her aging grandparents still in Bluff Springs, she was sure it would be okay with Mrs. Boley. But unbeknownst to Mrs. Boley, it appears Vivian's plan was to meet someone she already knew on the side. So, when it was time to head for home, 21-year-old James Leron Brown met her at their car, where he appears to have had plans of his own. His plan was for her to accompany him to Pensacola in his car unchaperoned without Lily along. She acquiesced. When Vivian did not return home with her daughter, Mrs. Boley sent for Vivian's mother. One can only imagine what was going through Mrs. McGowan's mind on that long train ride from Mobile, but one thing was for sure, she was bringing hell with her. In the meantime, James was taking Vivian out to supper at a nice restaurant, and then followed his seduction with a nice movie at the Isis Theater on the northeast corner of Garden and Palafox Street, whose building is still there. Whether planned or just by happenstance, the motion picture show just so happened to be playing a very risque film, called The House of Bondage, about a young girl rebelling against her strict school, who is tricked by a romantic suitor into prostitution. Could it be possible Vivian was rebelling against her convent restrictions, as well as her mother? After the movie, he informed Vivian that it was much too late for her to head for Mrs. Boley's home, and for her safety she should let him get her a hotel room. She finally agreed with his suggestion, and they proceeded across the street from the theater to Hughey's Hotel at 37 South Palafox Street. The hotel was the property of Lucius Ladimer Hughey and his wife Eunice Herminia. But unbeknownst to Vivian, James had registered her as a Mrs. Williams from Havana. In the meantime, she retired to her room alone, but before long there was a knock on the door. When she opened it, the suspicious hotel clerk asked if Mr. Brown was in the room. Remember, this was a different time with different rules about any unmarried unchaperoned female sharing a room with a male. As he could plainly see, Mr. Brown wasn't there, so he left. After another 30 minutes went by, James walked into the room without knocking. She asked him what he meant by coming into her room, and he replied, "I'm going to stay here tonight." The young girl protested, but he explained to her that they would both be arrested and taken to jail if she screamed. Doubtfully, a 15-year-old girl of the time was aware of such laws about these things. He also told her that since he considered them engaged to be married, the police wouldn't do anything anyway. However, this inference suggests that their relationship did not begin in the parking lot of Foot Barrancas. Although what happened that night was never mentioned in explicit detail in the papers or in court, the inference and language was that Vivian had been sexually violated. The next day, Vivian and James left the hotel, whereas Vivian was taken into custody by a relative awaiting her mother's arrival. Unfortunately for James, he didn't have long to wait for her mother's arrival in Pensacola. When Florence exited the train at the Wright Street depot, she was met by Mrs. Boley, who told her the details to date as she knew them. Vivian had already been transported to her grandparents' house in Bluff Springs and awaited her mother there. After her conversation with Mrs. Boley, Mrs. McGowan immediately headed north by car and took charge of Vivian. Could her own marriage at 14 and unhappy divorce have played a part on Florence's mind at this point and added to her hurt, guilt, and anger? She spoke briefly with the deputies there about what had happened, who then forwarded their findings to Pensacola. The next morning Florence and Vivian both returned to Pensacola. One can only imagine the conversation in that car en route. At this point, Florence met with the law enforcement authorities in Pensacola, who issued a warrant for the arrest of James. Shortly thereafter, they received word that James had left town on July 31st. Based on this information, they notified the Mobile police to be on the lookout for him should he head in their direction. Sure enough, Mobile located him on August 2nd and took him into custody. On August 3rd, he was transported back to Pensacola and given an arraignment date of August 6th. Apparently, the relationship between Vivian and James had gone much longer and further than was acceptable for that day and time. But at the same time, the court had an enraged mother on their hands demanding justice be carried out immediately. As the prosecutor and defense attorney prepared for the August 6th arraignment, Mrs. McGowan had her own preparations to make on how to deal with the alleged ruination of her daughter. In line with her rage, she met with Lulu's husband, Louis Boley, who had bought a pistol from a guy he worked with, by the name of Randolph Eugene Presley. Louis would testify that the gun had been bought prior to the shooting. The pistol would be identified in court as the one that was used to kill James Brown. As to whether Louis or Lula gave it to Florence, sold it to her, or did she take it from their nightstand is still in question. So, who was this rakish seducer exactly? James was from Bonifay, Florida, but was living with his parents, James Wesley Brown and Mary Frances Harrell, at number 30 West Wright Street. When notified, his father immediately hired a well-known Pensacola attorney, Richard Pope Reese, to represent his son in the coming legalities. Around town, the saucy story already had all the makings of a monstrous headline case. Brown's arraignment was set for August 6th at noon, and would be held at the Escambia County Courthouse on the northeast corner of Chase and Palafox Street. Judge Henry Bellinger would be presiding over the case at hand, and he was going through the preliminary procedures with the attorneys prior to setting a trial date. They had just agreed that Brown would be bound over for trial at the next regular term of court, and he would be eligible for bail. On advice of his lawyer, he had waived examination of the case, and they were discussing what amount of bail was to be set for his release. The purpose of the bail which was set at $250, was to ensure his prompt return to court on whatever date was set. As Brown and his attorney were signing the required papers for his bond, Vivian's mother came to the bench and demanded an explanation of what was going on. Judge Bellinger patiently tried to explain the proceedings to her. At this time, she asked if she could speak to Brown's attorney. Mr. Reese agreed and suggested that they step into the office of School Superintendent Albert Edwards for privacy. The crux of her concern was she had expected a trial to commence at noon, but instead it looked like Brown's case was being thrown out of court, and he was being set free. She implored Mr. Reese to explain what the hell was going on. He repeated what the judge had told her and further replied that Brown was doing everything he could to set things right, to include offering to marry Vivian. But Mrs. McGowan didn't believe him. Then, she seemed to change her tone and stated, "I think this is for the best, but before I agree, I would like to hear his intentions from his own lips. Was this a precursor to murder, or a clarification of intent?" Believing her, Mr. Reese asked the deputy if he would escort Brown into the room, and he would be responsible for his custody. Therefore, the young man was escorted to the superintendent's office. Brown attempted to shake Mrs. McGowan's hand, but she replied, "I don't know if I want to shake your hand or not." She then stated, "You'll marry my daughter." That is adding insult to injury. At this, Mr. Reese stepped over to close the office door left open by the deputy. Within seconds, Mrs. McGowan pulled a pistol from her purse and shot Brown 3 times. She attempted a 4th shot, but the pistol misfired before she was enveloped by a deputy. A deputy rushed outside and flagged down a passing car driven by Dr. Thomas R. Stokes. They loaded Brown up and took him around the corner to the Pensacola Hospital at Baylen and Garden Street. Mrs. McGowan was immediately arrested and taken to the county jail by Deputy James R. Marble. There, she told Sheriff Andrew K. Ellis that, "I meant just what I did, to shoot him down and kill him." When Mrs. McGowan was told of Brown's death, she replied, "God help him, for I can't." On August 8, a coroner's jury was quickly held and the evidence reviewed, although Florence was never put on the stand to testify. Her attorney, Celestino Moreno Jones, interviewed 4 witnesses, all of which testified to the overwhelming evidence against her. But to the contrary, Mrs. McGowan's actions were deemed justifiable homicide. But her joy of the verdict was short-lived, because immediately following the court's decision, she was once again taken into custody. This warrant was for premeditated murder, as sworn by Brown's father, James Wesley Brown. The second warrant was for carrying a concealed weapon, sworn out by Constable Stephen Judge Jones. Bond was set at $2,200 arranged by her attorney along with Stokes' agreement. Her bond was signed by Louis and Michael C. Boley, and she was released. While new charges were being discussed on Mrs. McGowan, the remains of James were being shipped by train to Bonifay, Florida for burial on August 7. His casket was placed aboard the eastbound train at 6:40 p.m., with just enough time for his family to gather on August 8 to say goodbye to their son. With James now buried, and Florence released on bond, the stage was now set for the second chapter of this terrible drama. To begin with, Florence's murder charge was now set for trial on November 5, 1914. With a trial date in hand, the wheels of justice began to turn once again, with the appointment of the opposing legal teams. Her case would be prosecuted by John Patrick Stokes and James Walter Kehoe. As for Stokes, he was a native-born Pensacolian who served for several years as a state attorney before being elected to the Florida Senate. Ironically, he would later become a law partner of Scott M. Loftin, the opposing counsel on this particular trial. James Walter Kehoe was the second attorney assigned to prosecute Florence McGowin. He was reputed to be a brilliant attorney who began his law practice in Milton in 1889. Together, he and Stokes would represent a formidable team for the prosecution. On the side of the defense, Scott Marion Loftin from Pensacola and Frank Singleton Stone from Baldwin County would be representing Florence. Loftin was born in Montgomery, Alabama, in 1878 and moved to Pensacola shortly afterwards. His father, William M. Loftin, had founded the Pensacola Journal in 1887. Scott was admitted to the bar in 1898 at the age of 19 years old. The 51-year-old Frank Singleton Stone, a prominent lawyer from Baldwin County, Alabama, was selected to assist Scott Loftin in behalf of Florence McGowin. Perhaps, he was compelled to join the defense team because of Florence's work as a nurse in Mobile where he practiced law. From the beginning of this entire case, public sympathy had been on the side of Florence, as witnessed by this August 9 editorial from Orlando. The writer references the Breathitt County, Kentucky murders of political opponents, and Sic semper bestiae is Latin for so always the beast. Finally, November 5 rolled around and it was time to go to court. Newspaper headlines all across America were breathlessly following this case. Locally, one of the reasons people were so enthralled was that no white woman had ever been charged with murder here before. So, the question was, what would an all-male jury do now, given the circumstances? Plus, this case struck deep into every mother's heart, who were trying to protect their daughters from those that would seduce them over to the dark side. However, on the other hand, James Brown was killed before having his day in court, with a chance to prove his innocence. Even if he was guilty, given the overwhelming evidence provided by Stokes and Kehoe, was a death sentence justifiable? The first order of business was to select the all-male jury, who would examine the facts and return an unbiased decision based on those facts alone. The following 12 men were selected through the voir dire process: 1. Lambert Gonzalez, 2. Morris Hillehand Creighton, a 29-year-old carpenter, 3. J. H. Knowles, 4. John M. Burrow, the 51-year-old owner of the Burrow Printing Company, 5. C. H. Jackson, 6. Charles H. Villa, a 36-year-old foreman with the Warren Fish Company, 7. George Washington Pate, the 30-year-old owner of the Pate Stevedoring Company, 8. James M. Finlay, 9. J. B. Botts, 10. Herbert Pinckney Caro, a 28-year-old clerk, 11. Ernest Ellis Harper, a 24-year-old officer with the Pensacola Police Department, and 12. James William Majors, a 33-year-old streetcar inspector, whose father was a Confederate veteran of the Battle of Atlanta. Everyone felt for sure that Mrs. McGowan would plead not guilty by using the age-old unwritten law defense. This defense says that a parent or husband has the right to kill whosoever has seduced and dishonored their wife or child, thereby ruining their honor and reputation. The law was not a law, but was used many times as a defense with just as many juries. As the clock struck 8 a.m., the judge wasted no time starting the trial. As soon as he took the bench, he informed the state to call their first witness. As the morning proceeded, almost all the witnesses testified that they heard the gunshots and saw Brown laying on the floor with Mrs. McGowan standing over him, with a pistol in her hand. Some told the jury of various comments of admission that Florence made, and several saw her throw the pistol out the window prior to being subdued. On this testimony alone, it looked like a slam-dunk case for the prosecution. One witness even smelled whiskey on her breath. Another witness, Gustavus Gus Adolphus Soderlind, testified that he was walking outside when he heard shots fired, then saw Mrs. McGowan throw the pistol out the window. Soderlind picked the pistol up and went inside and handed it to one of the deputies. While there, he heard Florence say, "He wasn't no gentleman." At 3:20 p.m., Florence took the stand and was sworn in. She tearfully testified that Buster Brown never denied seducing her daughter Vivian. Buster Brown was the logo for the Brown Shoe Company, thus it became an often used popular slang in 1904, as well as James' nickname. Brown's sister, Minnie Prevatt, testified that when she reached her brother on the floor, he whispered to her, "Minnie, I'm gone." She further stated that as Florence was being escorted out, she said to Minnie, "Goodbye." Minnie explained that she had contacted Florence at Mrs. Boley's house prior to the shooting to persuade her to consider letting her brother and Vivian marry. Florence refused and stated, "I'd rather see my daughter a free woman, unmarried, and on Zaragoza Street, location of the brothels, than the wife of Buster Brown." Mrs. Gowan told her that Vivian was much wrapped up in Buster Brown. Deputy Joseph Robert Marble testified that he had asked Florence if she had loaded the gun to kill Brown. She replied, "Not only him, but anybody else." As Florence began testifying about Vivian's story, the state objected to the testimony as irrelevant since it came from Florence and not Vivian. The judge ordered the jury out of the room as he and the attorneys discussed the matter. Finally, the judge overruled the objection and her testimony continued. Vivian was issued a subpoena to appear, but it was returned unserved. When her mother was asked as to her whereabouts, she told the court that she was in school in Mississippi. However, Vivian did appear, but there is no indication that she ever testified. When the state and defense rested their case, the judge sent the jury into deliberation and held that the evidence had shown the defendant guilty of murder. During the deliberation, 9 men voted for acquittal and 3 for manslaughter. But eventually, they held out for a finding of not guilty. When announced, the courtroom erupted in cheering. One question that many readers have is whatever happened to those involved in this macabre story. As far as Marie Florence Moore McGowan is concerned, she and Clarence Augustus McGowan of Bruton had been married on March 7, 1897 in Evergreen, Alabama. Their wedding article states, "It is an old story of ardent, youthful love and opposition by the young lady's parents, but love finds a way." Was this a prediction of what was to come for Vivian? Clarence ran a livery stable to support their family at the time, but sadly the marriage failed and they were divorced in 1901. Following the trial, Florence all but disappeared. We do know that she died on November 19, 1925 in Houston, Texas of uterus cancer. The records infer that her remains were returned home and buried in Bluff Springs, Florida, although there's no listing in the cemetery there. She is also said to have remarried to F. Osborne prior to her death. As to Clarence Augustus, he was born in 1875 in Greenville and came to Bruton as a child in 1877. Following his marriage to Florence, he would remarry Addie Clara Lewis in 1903. He would pass away in 1939 and was buried in the Fort Crawford Cemetery in East Bruton, Alabama. Clarence was the son of Joseph E. McGowan and Laura H. Kennedy. In later life, he became a carpenter and even later, a grocery merchant. Florence's parents were elderly at the time of this event with Vivian. Her father, John Gordon Moore, had enlisted in the 33rd Alabama Infantry Regiment of the Confederate Army in March 1862. Initially organized in Pensacola, Florida, he would fight with the Army of Tennessee all the way to their surrender at Bentonville. By the time John and his comrades surrendered, there were very few of them left to return home. As his age advanced, he applied for his Army pension and was finally granted $100 per year until his death in 1917. Afterwards, his widow Mary Florine was granted her widow's pension of $150 per year until she passed away in 1937, and was buried in the Bluff Springs Cemetery next to John. But what became of James' parents? His father was born in 1860, prior to the Civil War, and remained most of his life in Northwest Florida. In 1910, he was working in Marianna for the railroad, but by 1913 he had already relocated to Pensacola. There, he had settled his family into 214 North Alcanise Street and was supporting them as a buyer. The following year, he would see his son shot down in the Escambia County Courthouse. He had done everything he could to assist his son, but all to no avail. At this time, he and his family were living at 30 West Wright Street, just west of today's Christ Church. By 1920, they had relocated to Palmetto Beach, where he was working close by at the shipyard as a carpenter. This is the last historical reference of the family still united. Sometime afterwards, he and Mary Frances appear to have split up. James Wesley passed away in 1927 of a heart attack, and was buried in the Oak Ridge Cemetery in Madison County, Florida. Mary Frances, on the other hand, would pass away in Graceville, Florida. Henry Bellinger was the judge in Florence's case, and was a public servant most of his life. As early as 1895, he was a clerk for the U.S. Marshal's office in Pensacola. 2 years later, he is listed as a chief's deputy. As early as 1909, he served as a county judge, and would do so until his death in 1922. He is buried in St. John's Cemetery next to his wife, Elizabeth Bessie Erin Sampe. Ironically, Bessie served as a county judge in her husband's stead, to serve out the remainder of his term. John Patrick Stokes was the prosecuting attorney in both cases of Florence McGowin. He was a native Pensacolian, born in 1889, and would pass away in Miami, Florida, in 1939. He would serve here as a state attorney, and for over 10 years, was a state senator for District 2. In 1922, he and his wife Bertha Hendricks would move to Miami, to open up a law firm there. James Walter Kehoe was the assisting prosecutor in the murder case against Florence. He was born in Eufaula, Alabama, in 1870, and moved to Marianna, Florida, with his family. He was admitted to the bar in 1889, and would serve Pensacola as a state attorney for 12 years. He would serve as a U.S. congressman and in the Florida legislature before passing away in 1938. He is buried in the Graceland Memorial Cemetery in Coral Gables, Florida. Celestino Moreno Jones was born in San Antonio, Texas, in 1865, after his father had left the Union Army to join the Confederacy. He served with the 1st Alabama Regiment, followed by service with the 37th. He moved his family to Pensacola before 1880, where he supported them as a lawyer. As to Celestino, he was admitted to the Florida bar at 21, and would serve as an assistant U.S. attorney. In 1900, he was elected to the Florida House of Representatives, and from 1901 to 1902 he served as our mayor. In 1917, he became a municipal judge of the Court of Record. He would pass away in 1938, and was buried in St. Michael's Cemetery with his family. As assistant counsel in Florence's murder trial, Frank Singleton Stone Jr. was born in 1863 in the town of Montrose in Baldwin County, Alabama. He was the son of Frank Singleton Stone Sr., a popular steamboat captain on the Tombigbee River. He would pass away in 1926 and was buried in Magnolia Cemetery in Mobile. Richard Pope Reese was the attorney for James Leron Brown at the time James was murdered. He was born in 1868 in Garden Valley, Texas. He was admitted to the bar in 1896 and had a stellar legal career in the Pensacola community. He was appointed judge of the Court of Record in 1938 and occupied this position until his death in 1941. He is buried in St. John's Cemetery. Richard was named after his uncle Richard Lewis Reese and his mother's maiden name of Pope. His father was a first lieutenant in the 57th Alabama Infantry Regiment, while his uncle Richard was with the 1st Alabama, then the 37th. Judge Reese remained a pillar of the legal community throughout his lifetime. However, the memory of watching Florence gun down James Brown right in front of him remained with him always. Lucius Latimer Hughey, who owned and ran the Salacious Hotel where these fatal events began, was born in 1864 in Calhoun, Georgia. He would migrate to Pensacola in 1902 as an agent for the Crescent News and Hotel Company. Here, he opened a lunch and newsstand business at 37 South Halifax Street. He would pass away in 1932 and was buried in St. John's Cemetery. Sheriff's Office Deputy Joseph Joe Robert Marble, who took Florence into custody, was born in 1888 in Tuckerman, Arkansas. He would arrive in Pensacola prior to 1892, with his parents William Ezra Marble and Sarah Jones. By 1910, he owned his own vegetable business, and 4 years later he was arresting Florence for murder. Years after the trial, Joe became the chief deputy to Sheriff James Van Pelt and later a police officer under Chief Frank D. Sanders. Then, on January 7, 1933, he was driving on today's Highway 29, north of Molino, when he lost control and flipped over. He was critically injured with a fractured skull that would take his life the following day of January 8. He was buried in St. John's Cemetery. Thus ends the tale of love and tragedy, two human events that follow us through the ages and will doubtless follow us still. They are timeless themes that resonate across all cultures and eras. They shape and are shaped by our stories, memories, and emotions, persisting throughout literature, art, and our daily life, as they serve as a mirror of our very existence.